Thank you so much, Christiane. That was the perfect introduction, listening to Ginger Shankar for this panel today. Ginger, thank you, and thank all of your musicians for bringing in our grandmothers. And it's actually how I want to start this panel because Sir Richard Roberts, you told me an interesting way in which you honor all of our grandmothers, and I want to invoke that today with our panel. Could you tell us a little bit about your grandmother clause and why that's important today? I want to invoke it for our panel and why it's important for science, given this current environment we're in too.
Well, I think basically what you're talking about is something that I call the grandmother test. And this relates to students who go home and tell their parents and friends what they do in the lab every day. And science communication is so important. And so if you want to know if you're communicating effectively, you should undertake the grandmother test. And in this test, you go and explain to your grandmother exactly what it is you do in the lab every day and why you're doing it in language that she can understand. And once you feel that she's understood it, she has to then go and tell all her friends what a wonderful scientist you are and boast about you. And if they too understand it, then you have passed the grandmother test. But if it doesn't go that far and you have to start again, I'm afraid you failed and you have to take the test all over again.
And why is that? You know, I was thinking about our breakthrough panel, and all of you are on the verge of different breakthroughs in the industries you're in. Why do you think that language accessibility, that grandmother test, is important to get us into the future? Richard.
Well, are you asking me or someone else?
Sure. Just to give us a little more on that. Thanks.
Yes, I mean, I think it's just that when you look around and you see people who are hesitant about taking vaccines because they don't understand how important these are and what a wonderful health measure this is. And people tend to be a little distrustful about science because I think we as scientists have not done the very best job we could in terms of communicating with the public about what we do. We tend to use acronyms. We tend to use terms that the average person doesn't understand because we're trying to show everybody how smart we are. But that's not smart. What is smart is really explaining things in terms that everyone can understand.
Thank you so much. And so we're going to try to do that today. Also, just for my understanding, since I don't know a lot of the acronyms, but for all of you out there too. And it reminds me something actually, Tamar, of what you said, just turning this a little bit when we were talking, you blew me away when you said, referring again to our grandmothers, that in some ways, our grandmothers were better off than we are today. What did you mean by that? How are moms doing?
Yeah, it's a slightly different kind of grandmother test, I think, to ask ourselves how our quality of life now compares to that of our grandmothers. I really believe that you can measure the health and the thriving of a nation by how its mothers are faring. And, you know, when we were discussing this before, with that metric, we're not actually doing very well in the United States at the moment. So I was referring to our maternal mortality rate, which is the highest in the developed world and has been going up, while that rate in other developed countries has actually historically been going down. And so that increasing rate means that it's actually more dangerous for someone to give birth now in the United States than it was for their mother or for their grandmother.
Can you tell me, just a follow-up, a little bit about what you're doing about that? I know this is something that you're working on right now. It terrifies me to hear that as a mom, and I know you're a mom too. And I'd love to know a little bit about the hope and optimism.
Absolutely. And there is hope for sure. So, you know, many of our maternal deaths, the majority of our maternal deaths, both here in the US and worldwide, are preventable. Many of them occur because of system failures. So these are failures to detect and treat risks and to offer kind of services and supports that are needed by birth-giving people. Much of the failure of the system is due to racism. So racism that has affected our nation's infrastructure, from where we kind of build highways and bridges, to our social norms around patient care, and even kind of disparities in things like treating pain, which is reflected in our numbers. So our nation's Black and Native birth-giving people die from pregnancy-related complications at kind of 2 to 4 times the rate of people who are white or Hispanic or Asian American. So These numbers are pretty shocking, but we are working very hard to try and develop technologies that are really centered around patients' needs, patients' values, and collecting information from patients in between kind of routine prenatal care, so that we can do a faster job of kind of IDing risks and connecting pregnant people to resources that they need in a more timely way.
And I see, Rana, you nodding, and it reminds me a lot of when I hear speak. What you talk about is the possibility of technology and technology of the future, and what we could do to solve some of these problems. So you give me a lot of hope. I want to turn it right to you. And one of the phrases I learned from you was technological stewardship. And I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about why that's so important for the future, and the future you see as possible with that type of stewardship.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very excited to be here today with you all. And the grandmother test really resonates with me. I'm originally from Cairo, Egypt. And my images and my memories of my grandma is just gathering all of our family in our summer house. And we had mango groves, and the generosity and the hospitality and the level of empathy has definitely been a thread that's inspired my work and my research. So I'm in the business of building artificial emotional intelligence so that we can improve our human machine interfaces, but fundamentally reimagine how we connect and communicate with one another in an increasingly digital universe. So we're trying to quantify people's nonverbal expressions, our facial expressions, our hand gestures, our vocal intonations. We want our computers to be able to detect and interact with us just the way we interact with one another. And one of the big areas of focus for this technology is in mental health, and how can we bring a data-driven approach to quantifying stress, anxiety, depression, autism, Parkinson's. So I think there's a lot of potential use for this technology. And if we do it right, and this is where the technology stewardship comes into place, I feel strongly that as the thought leader and innovator in this space, it's incumbent on me and my team to make sure that we do this ethically, that we do this with diversity, equity, and inclusion in mind. And I spend a fair amount of my energy evangelizing for this new tech category.
Yeah. And I would love to know, it actually brings us right to the point of inequality, which is a perfect transition, which I know this entire conference is looking on the inequities when we talk about global health. And that idea, I'm going to make sure I bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into everything I do in developing this technology. How do you do that? And how do the folks listening today, what are some of the things we can do to make that possible? And this is for all of you, because I know that each one of you is very passionate about the subject. But Rana, I guess if you could start.
Yeah, sure. I can start. Obviously, in technology, the big issue is, it's very male dominated as an industry, both for entrepreneurs and investors, the entire ecosystem, really. So I would say, first of all, feel empowered, right? As a consumer and as a user of technology, we have a lot of power in our hands, and I guess the message for everybody tuned in is to be empowered to vote with your feet, like vote for companies and embrace companies that embrace these core values of privacy and ethics and equality and inclusion. As thought leaders and maybe as managers, I think it's important that we prioritize diversity and be very intentional about it. In our field, it's all about data diversity and mitigating data and algorithmic bias. That's something that we spend a lot of our energy thinking about, because we each have our own biases, right? And if we don't have diverse voices around the table, then we're developing and deploying these technologies at scale with not everybody in mind. So yeah, it's really important to be intentional about these things.
And I'm interested about who's around the table. And actually, Richard and Tamar, this is something I've heard both of you talk about, is that women leaders during the pandemic did much better than their male counterparts. I would love to know, one, scientifically, I know, Sir Richard, you were involved a bit in some of the technology that got vaccines out there, but also, Tamar, you study decision making as a science. Are we better decision makers? I'm curious on why this was the case. And this is for both of you.
I think our women leaders are being lauded for their pandemic response. They're, I think, only 10% of our nations are led by women, so it's hard to make comparisons. But I think, bringing it back to Sir Richard's discussion about science communication and thinking about decision making, I think a lot of the successes that we've witnessed for female-led nations have been in implementing effective behavioral measures in response to the pandemic. And the key to doing that, what we maybe haven't done as well in the US, is to engage in good risk communication right from the beginning. And so rather than kind of reactively trying to counter misinformation as it emerges, the science really shows that if people can understand what behaviors they need to engage in and why, with really clear, consistent, transparent messaging from kind of trustworthy sources. And I think especially when that is paired with the social structure and supports to be able to do it, they will. And I think, that's what we've seen in countries like New Zealand and Finland and Taiwan, so countries with strong female leadership. And I can't say for sure why these specific leaders have taken this approach, but bringing it back to diversity, I really do believe that diversity in leadership is necessary, because if you have leaders with the lived experience and the ability to evaluate the evidence in the areas for which they're responsible for making policy, that's actually the only way to represent the voices of the people that they're serving.
And Richard, even with good leadership, I know in your fight on thinking about how do we end world hunger, and you've been on the forefront of activism around this for a long time, there's other blocks in solving it, and not just leadership. But the distribution right now with vaccines, I can't help but think there's some parallels to what you saw in food distribution as well. I'd love to hear just what you're thinking and what needs to be done so that we can solve some of these big problems.
Okay, well, I just make one comment about female leadership. I believe women are so much more empathic, and this was a word that Rana was talking about earlier. This is why they make good leaders, because instead of just thinking about themselves, they think about the population that they're serving, about the country they're trying to serve. I think also women tend to be a little more honest than men when they're politicians. I can see a few exceptions to that. For the most part, I think they're pretty honest. And that too is something that comes across in a good leader when you're honest. And I think, Joe Biden actually could almost be a woman. He's got great empathy, and he really is honest about what he's doing. To get to the distribution of resources, I think one of the problems that we face in this world is that the developed countries just go ahead and on developing things that are good for them without giving much thought to whether or not this is going to be helpful to the rest of the world, and particularly the developing world. And the vaccine situation is a little bit more tricky. There are supply problems with getting all of the key reagents you need. There's also some technical issues, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, which depend on messenger RNA. These really have great difficulties in terms of the technical expertise and the supplies that are needed in order to make them. But this is something that in time, I think, will be distributed much more widely. But the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines, these could be made anywhere. They are being made anywhere. But again, the focus has always been people want to look after themselves, and they don't think about the bigger picture, and they don't think about all of the places that they might want to visit in the future, where they're going to go to places where the population is not vaccinated. And so it would be good if people could think a little more widely about that. And the food problem, I think in the developing countries, this is really a tragedy. And I've been organizing a campaign among the Nobel laureates to support the use of GMO technology in order to make plants better, to make better crops, more nutritious crops, crops with higher yields. And what's happened in the West, we've done that. We've got yields maximally, but in the developing world, they've never had the resources to improve their crops. And GMO technology allows them to do that. And for the Europeans to take an anti-GMO stance on an issue that is really about raising money for their organization rather than thinking about the science, I find this appalling. They they are killing people in the third world because they are anti-GMO, and they're sending missionaries out to try and stop the developing world from using GMOs to improve crops. And I always tell them it's foolish, because if people are hungry, they're going to go to where there's food. And if Europe thinks it's got an immigration problem now, just wait until Africa gets really hungry.
The conversation brings us back to empathy again with food as well. And so I have to turn it to you, Rana, and talk a little bit about empathy is such an important tool block of what solves problems now, what will solve problems in the future. And I'm curious, when we look at technology and empathy, is it something, can machines learn empathy? Can they learn emotional intelligence? How critical is that for our future? And I'm sure you hear people that that get scared around that thought and that idea. I'd love just to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so empathy is at the core of how we connect and communicate as humans. It's also how we build trust and loyalty. And a lot of how we build empathy is not the explicit words we say. It's actually the implicit behaviors, our implicit nonverbal connections and communications. And so what we're trying to do is, we're trying to build empathetic skills into our machines and into our technologies. A machine will never truly have empathy the way a human does, but it can exhibit signs of empathy. And because technology is so deeply ingrained in everything we're doing, and it's taking on roles that were traditionally done by people, I do think we need to redesign our relationship with machines and put empathy at the center of how we design these things, how we deploy them, how we think about them, how they respond to us as humans. So I'm a huge advocate of taking a very human-centric approach to thinking about all of this. There are truly transformative applications of this technology, everything from mental health and making our roads safer and, helping us be more productive and connected people. But you're right. This could be, it's very personal data, and it could be really abused and used for manipulation and for surveillance and discrimination and profiling. So I've taken a very strong stance, both for the company, but also more widely, that we need thoughtful regulation to stop some of these nefarious use cases. But also, again, we as leaders and as stewards of this tech category, we need to take the high road. My company has turned down millions of dollars of potential revenue and investment for, in applying our technology and security and surveillance, because we do not believe that that's the right use case. And so I think we need more leaders who are willing to do that.
I was wondering if one of y'all wanted to jump in, because this is science and regulation have had a long history of how they work together. And I was wondering if anyone has the right prescription for the future and how we do this. Tamar.
Yeah, I mean,
it looked like you were about to speak.
These are all issues that we're also thinking about in addressing maternal health with artificial intelligence in terms of risk prediction and identification. And, we know these kinds of algorithms that we use, they're only as good as the data that goes into them, which Rana has kind of brought up here. So I think nothing we do in this space is really going to move the needle until it addresses the root causes of inequity. And that's from the perspective of the people that these things are designed to serve. And so always bringing that human element into the planning of research, the development of research, and the kind of dissemination of a product is so critical. So I think an example from kind of my space is you could have a beautiful risk prediction algorithm for maternal mortality that would require data from an ultrasound, but that's only going to work in an environment where you can access an ultrasound. It's realistic, it's affordable. It doesn't have inadvertently harmful consequences, for example, where it might result in unwanted pressure to end a pregnancy, or it might take away from investment in other things that support more basic human needs. And so I think I don't know exactly how you translate that into regulation, but I think always making sure that we come back to the human element in every step of kind of design and implementation of these things is is really critical for moving forward.
One of the things that I'm always concerned about when we sort of think about technology and the way that it is really interfering in many cases with people's lives is social media. And, you know, the algorithms now running really direct information from the internet to people who are receptive recipients of it. And so we talk about bias. Rana mentioned bias. And many of these algorithms that are deciding who, you know, what you're going to get from social media, terribly biased, deliberately biased. And I think this is something that it would be very good if we could find a way around this. I'm not sure legislation is necessarily the way to go, but perhaps artificial intelligence could be used in a much more positive way to make sure that people do not just see one side of a story and get more and more of it and be convinced of things that are simply not true. And, you know, truth is something that is in rather short supply very often.
Absolutely. This to me is one of the biggest issues that we're looking at right now is truth. And I look to all of y'all as leaders in your sectors to really help us get there. We're coming up on time, but there's enough time for each one of you. Since this is our breakthrough panel and we're moving towards action, I'd love to give each one of you a chance to talk about what you're working on and how we can act. Any individual watching this today, if there's something, a place where they can go and learn more, or something they can do to take action to get us to this next future, the future that we're all dreaming of, I'd love to hear from each of you what's on your mind. So Rana.
Okay, I'll go first. I would say, please know that you have a say in how technology shapes up and how it unfolds over the next few years. And if you're interested in some of the ethical considerations in developing and deploying AI, check out the Partnership on AI Consortium. It's all about building fair, accountable, transparent, and ethical AI systems. And I want to put a final plug in for empathy and empathetic leadership. Please prioritize empathy. We need more of it.
And Rana, where can people find out more? You mentioned one place, but if they just want to know more about you and what you're doing.
I'm easy to find on social media, but also my book just came out. So Girl Decoded, it's a memoir. And it does simplify the technology. I talk about how do you build emotion AI and why, and some of the ethical and moral questions that we have to ask ourselves. So
great.
Thank you.
Tamar.
So I'm very excited to be kind of working right now on thinking about how we can move from big data to better data with the clinical tools that we're building. So, I think a call to action is, we as scientists need to be more thoughtful, more responsible about the data we're collecting and how we're interpreting it. So in terms of action items for scientists, I would say, to really understand what better data means, we need to be cognizant at every research step about the impacts of our work. So being in truly interdisciplinary teams as we move forward with historians and social scientists and community members as collaborators with us, I think that will help us kind of answer the questions of how our research, how the data we're collecting and using, how that might exacerbate or address existing societal harms. And I think scientists, please run for office, and please vote for scientists who are running for office. That's one way to really kind of get involved and make your voice heard.
Thank you
Nisha,
so much.
Can a call to action be a technology? Can a call to action be a technology Nobel Prize? A Nobel Prize for technology?
There you go. You've heard it. Rana has a call to action for this community. And Sir Richards, you might be the one to answer that call, but what's on your mind?
Well, I can tell you, I've been watching this Derek Chauvin trial, and something that came out during that alarmed me more than anything else was the fact that the initial police report was a series of lies. And it was only because a young lady had the presence of mind and courage to photograph what was going on, that the police decided, well, now we have to change our report. And I think for me, this just emphasizes that if you're really going to try and do something to reform behavior, whether it's police or anybody else, is to inflict penalties for lying. We need more truth. We need people to just simply tell the truth. We may not want to hear it all the time, and it may not be good in terms of getting elected, but it is important. And I think in the long run, people who tell the truth become respected. And that would be really my message. If you want to know more about what I'm doing, you can email me. I'll be happy to send you some sites and places you can go. But my work is on bacteria. I love bacteria. I think they're the greatest. And I would love to have the opportunity to convince you of the same.
That's fantastic. And my organization is called Dream Corps. I'll take moderator privilege to tell you that we have a member network of folks that fight on criminal justice reform, climate justice, and tech equity. So we fit right in the wheelhouse here, and our members are active. We have actions you can take. We also have the Empathy Network. So I'm really glad that we've worked on this. And the Empathy Network tells truth, and they tell their stories to try to change hearts and minds around the country. So you can also join us at Dream Corps. I really appreciate you all here today for bringing in our grandmothers, checking in on the moms, and thinking about how do we start addressing inequality, that the next breakthrough that comes has to address inequality or it's not a real breakthrough. And so I really appreciate you all being with us today. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Christiane, and I'll see everyone later.